Hi folks, how you going? My name's Michael Mitchell and I'll be hosting this discussion on behalf of Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing at the University of Western Australia. And today we're going to be yarning about social and emotional wellbeing with Associate Professor Graham G, Dr. Clinton Schultz and Maddison O'Grady-Lee. So firstly, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge that we are situated on Noongar land, that Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of this land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge here in Noongar country. We recognise that people are joining us remotely from many different lands across Australia, and we thank you for joining us. And we therefore pay our respects to the cultural custodians of these lands. We also acknowledge our allies and supporters who work with us towards social justice. Last year was the 10th anniversary of Working Together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health and Wellbeing Principles and Practice, second edition. We did have a copy here, didn't we? Where is it? This baby, yeah. So it was and is a landmark textbook, and it was absolutely central in decolonising the discourse around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing in Australia. We've been celebrating this anniversary here at Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing, looking back at the incredible work that was done in 2014, and also talking about where we go to next. We've been collecting testimonials from users of the book, filming interviews with the editors and authors, and we've been hosting webinars discussing topics from the book. This webinar is the next in that series, and we're really grateful to have three very accomplished and passionate panellists here with us today, including two of the co-authors of the Working Together book. So, before we get started, a couple of housekeeping points. Cameras and audio for all attendees are automatically turned off. This event is being recorded and we will share the recording and the PowerPoint slides later with everyone who registered. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. To do so, type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen. You can begin to do so now and throughout the webinar. And look, with regards to the questions, we're not going to get through all of them, but we'll endeavour to get to them. And it also gives us food for thought about what we do and where we're going in future stuff. So we will endeavour to respond to as many as possible. We also wanted to thank everyone for their support in attending our Working Together webinars and taking part in our celebrations. We really appreciate it, and all your questions. We would love to also hear your ideas on future events and webinars you would be interested. So feel free to type those into the Q&A box also. And look, just a little bit of trivia for us. So a high-profile Aboriginal person told me that the webinars are great, and they look forward to each and every one and said they were more than useful. So thanks for that feedback. I'll be introducing each of the incredible panellists shortly, but first I'll introduce myself. So my name's Michael Mitchell. I'm a Yamatji man, Mulgana on my mother's side from Shark Bay, which is the Bloody Mob. And up in the Pilbara, I'm Nyamal on the Mitchell side. I've sort of grown up in Carnarvon, Shark Bay. Shark Bay was interesting. No racism in Shark Bay, still is to this day. So we were brought up a bit differently till I moved to Carnarvon. Then I found out I was Aboriginal. And yeah, but that was great. Now, I've worked in mental health for a fair while now, social and emotional wellbeing. I've done a range of jobs, managing AMS, CDP program, and also the statewide specialist Aboriginal mental health service here in WA, which was a $10 million program. Our end was about 3.6 with 24 FTE, including psychiatry, mental, medical and traditional healers. So, yeah, so I've got a little bit of experience in the sector. And now our next, one of our speakers is Graham. Associate Professor Graham G is an Aboriginal Chinese man, also with Celtic heritage, originally from Darwin. His Aboriginal Chinese grandfather was born near Bellewen on Larrakia country. Graham is a clinical psychologist and worked at the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service for 11 years before taking up a senior research fellow position at Murdoch Children's Research Institute. His area of research is healing and recovery from complex trauma among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, with an increasing focus on child sexual abuse. In 2022, Graham received a fellowship from the Eisen Family Private Fund that has supported his team to commence formative work with a coalition of Victorian Aboriginal services dedicated to healing child sexual abuse. In 2023, he received an NHMRC Emerging Leadership Investigator Grant to progress this work with 6 Victorian Aboriginal services partners and survivors of child sexual abuse. Among other advisory roles, Graham sits on the National Clinical Reference Group for the Attorney General's Office and Cabinet National Office for Child Safety, and the Research Advisory Committee for the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse. Graham led Chapter 4 in the Working Together book entitled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social and Emotional Wellbeing. Introducing Clinton. Clinton Schultz is a Gamilaroi man and a licensed psychologist. His work delves deeply into concepts of law, culture, and the broad spectrum of health and wellness, emphasising the well-being of health and community service workers. His PhD, now there's Aboriginal language there, I could have a go, but so it's in English, Holistic Wellbeing for Aboriginal Health and Community Work. And we thank him for his work for community workers. Garnered Griffith University's Chancellor's Award for Academic Excellence in 2019. He plays a pivotal role as Director of First Nations Strategy and Partnerships at the Black Dog Institute and co-founded Soba Beverages. Don't think I've tried one of that. Dr. Schultz has published and presented extensively on the concept of social and emotional wellbeing from an Aboriginal perspective. He was one of the co-authors of Chapter 4 in the Working Together book entitled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Social and Emotional Wellbeing. We would like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the other authors of Chapter 4 in the Working Together book, Professor Pat Dudgeon, Amanda Hart, and Kerry Kelly. And finally, our final speaker is Maddison. Maddison O'Gradey-Lee is a lived experience advocate and psychology PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales and the Black Dog Institute. She aims to improve the measurement of mental ill health for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people with her research. She is the co-founder of the Origin Global Youth Advocacy Fellowship, which empowers young people around the world to advocate for mental health within their community. Over 21,000 young people have been reached through the direct and indirect impact of the program. Maddison has created a global community that's combating taboos around mental health and was the first person from Oceania to win the Dalai Lama Peace Fellowship. Well done. And just this year, Maddison was awarded the 2025 New South Wales Young Australian of the Year, and we congratulate her on that wonderful achievement. I'm now going to hand over to our panel so that they can talk a little about who they are, what they do, and their relationship with social and emotional wellbeing. Once we've finished that section, we'll be back for the Q&A section of the webinar. And just a little reminder that you can send your questions through now You don't have to wait until we start the Q&A. And as I said, we'll endeavour to get to your questions. And we do get a fair few, but we appreciate every question because it gives us stuff to think about down the track within our research processes here. So, firstly, over to Graham. And so let's hear from Dr. Graham G. Yep.
Thanks.
And then
You're right. You go.
You go. I'm done.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the very long introduction. I feel like there's not much more I can say about myself, at least from a work perspective. But thank you for inviting me onto this webinar. Just want to acknowledge everyone out there who's zooming in. Thanks for showing your interest in this yarn, and just want to pay my respects to the elders past and present and the First Nations lands from wherever you are zooming in from, and acknowledge that that land has never been ceded. Michael's spoken about my kind of family background. On my great-grandmother's side, she's from Central Northern Territory as well, the Quoll family. I should mention that, and also on my mum's side, Scottish and Irish heritage. And I'm married to a beautiful Norwegian wife for 24 years now. We've got 2 daughters. So that's a little bit about me. I guess from a social-emotional wellbeing perspective, I got involved in Aboriginal mental health and social-emotional wellbeing about 25 years ago. Back then, there was no training in Darwin, so I moved down here to Naarm on Wurundjeri country and studied at Melbourne University. Became a psychologist and worked really on the ground counselling for 11 years, and that was certainly the best, one of the best periods of my life at the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service. And I suppose that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, when you're working with families from multiple generations, and seeing the amazing strength and resilience and the beautiful cultures of our people, and the resilience that we have in terms of resisting colonisation and what have you. But also when you're working at a counselling service, you also see the pointy end of the stick and work with the most vulnerable families, where there's sometimes 2-3 generations of child removal and stolen generations and social disadvantage. And I think that's where I got really interested in social-emotional well-being, because the conventional understandings of mental health that I was learning at Melbourne University just didn't cut it. It didn't make sense, wasn't working for trying to support the community that I was increasingly belonging to and being accepted in, and have stayed here ever since. So, it was really on the ground where I was just having to, turn things on tables and just start really looking at how can we work with our own cultures and understand mental health and distress from our perspective. And during that time, really just 11 years of just working in the counselling rooms and going out on country and in men's groups and what have you, it was just absolutely fantastic, and quickly realised that conventional mental health wasn't going to cut it. It was probably around that time we established a group of us with Professor Pat Dudgeon, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association. I found out pretty quickly that I wasn't the only one, and other boys like Clinton and leaders like Professor Helen Milroy and Pat Dudgeon, Uncle Tom Karma, just many people were saying that what really wasn't working. We were getting, I suppose, inundated with requests from non-Indigenous allies that just asking questions about how to work in this space. And so basically, Clinton and myself and Pat and Amanda and Kerry Kelly locked ourselves in a room for 2 days in Brisbane and just started to really look at different ways you could slice the pie. And I was also doing research on Aboriginal understandings of mental health, which have always been there, but in a different way, different cultural understandings. So that was a bit of a departure point, I suppose, and we decided to write a chapter together. And since then, the last thing I'll say, and I'll pass the baton on, is once that framework was sort of developed, my work's really been about trying to apply that in programs that are Aboriginal designed in different community services, Aboriginal community controlled health services, developing tools as well, strength-based tools to use in our services, and working with complex trauma, which is a passion of mine. both from lived experience and also just really supporting lots of different families. And now I'm increasingly working at how do we look at social emotional wellbeing and mental health within contexts of child sexual abuse and healing and what have you. So that's me. I'll probably leave it there and hand over to Clinton or Maddison.
Gabananda Graham. Yamagabi Yaramali and Anigan Ungu. Mary William, Yelagim or Noraga Yelagan. Jidu I govern it. Yeah, so my background, I guess, in this space started from well before I was a psychologist or even went to university. I used to be a chef, and I was fortunate enough through chefing to travel a large part of Europe and work in some pretty prestigious restaurants and hotel chains and stuff within the UK and other parts of Europe. And it was while I was overseas for that long period of time that I really started to notice that while I'd kind of made a path for myself that had turned out okay, it had its own dramas. The hospitality industry can be pretty toxic. But while I'd sort of carved that path out, what I'd realised that was a lot of the young fellas that I'd sort of grown up with, gone to school with, I guess hadn't had the opportunity to experience or go on and have such a positive pathway that I seem to have made for myself. And I started to reflect on why was that? And it really came down to, I guess, the lack of support that we were offered as young people in high school. You know, I specifically remember, like when I was at high school, I specifically remember having a deputy principal literally say to me, I don't know why we waste our time with you. By the time you're 18, you're going to be dead or in jail. And that, you know, really, I guess, pissed me off back then. But it also, when I reflect back on it now, it motivated me to achieve everything that I've achieved, because from that second on, I wasn't going to ever have anybody tell me that I wasn't capable of actually doing more than what was expected of me as a young Aboriginal boy turning man. And I started to write up these programs while I was overseas about how we could better invest our time and energy and support into Aboriginal youth to help them just be the best they could be at whatever it was that they were interested in. You know, when I was young, unless you played sport or you were athletic, you got no support. But there was so many kids out there that were artistically brilliant, that were academically brilliant, but we just got written off. And so I came back to Australia after sort of 2.5 years, and I started hitting up some big multinational companies to give me some sponsorship to create and run out these programs. And those conversations were quite positive, but what came out of them most of the time was these mob going, these programs are great, but what's your qualifications to do it? And I'd kind of turn around and go, oh man, I'm a chef. And they'd go, what the hell's that got to do with this? What's that got to do with this program you just brought us? And I go, nothing, but I was one of these kids and I think I've figured it out and I think I've got something to offer. And every single one of them without fail would just go, well, come back to us when you've got a piece of paper saying you're qualified to do any of this. So I took myself off to Griffith University, the local university near where I live, and went to a couple of aunties there. And I said, look, this is kind of what I want to do. What do I need to study to be able to do that? And these aunties at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander support unit, Gumurri there, they started writing down this big long list of different programs, degrees that I could potentially do that would allow me to some stage, you know, go back to these organisations and hit them back up for funding. And I literally just closed my eyes and swung my finger around and went bang on a piece of paper, and that's how I entered psychology. So, you know, quite often people ask me, how'd you land in psychology? And it was by fluke or by luck, or maybe it was, you know, destiny, whichever way you want to look at it. So that was my start into the field, I guess, of psychology. I undertook a double degree in Bachelor of Psychology, Bachelor of Exercise Science. I ended up leaving exercise science 2.5 years in, because from being a chef, and I was still chefing all through uni, I figured out that I've got a really sensitive nose. And as soon as we had to start, you know, working with cadavers, they just smelt like bags of off prawns to me, and I couldn't handle the smell. So I had to let that go. And But I just solely then focused on psychology. And then my journey kind of became much like Graham has explained. I every day I was there, I was just going, this isn't about me. This isn't about my mob. This is somebody else determining what they think we should think and how we should think it. And that didn't really fit. And so I started, I guess, my campaigning, my lobbying from when I was in undergrad for us to be looking at how we could look at psychology differently. There had to be another way that we could reflect on this and make it more suitable for culturally diverse peoples, including us as mob. And there wasn't much acceptance of that back then. So we could just say I spent a lot of my time arguing at university with different people in the systems, and less time probably studying than I should have. And it was difficult because I just couldn't see a reflection of me in what they were trying to force down my throat. But I graduated, did honours, did my all the requirements to become qualified and to get my registration. But then when I was out practicing, it was the exact same thing. What I was being told to practice just didn't fit for people I wanted to work with. And so I was more and more thinking about how can I work outside, how can I massage the boundaries of what's accepted to be more suitable to the people that I want to work with and for the reasons that I want to work with people. That's, I only ever went into this to work with mob. And so it needed to fit with mob, the work that I was going to do. So I've really just, since that time at university, continued, I guess, to have that fight to let's look at how we can do this differently, and let's look at how we can do this in a more appropriate way. And that led us to all being in a room. We're all doing different pieces of work around the same frustrations. And really that frustration was, how do we take something that we understand as mob, but for people who have never stepped into this space see as overly complex? How do we take that complexity and present it in a way as simple as possible so that it can be understood, and there hopefully we'll get more inroads into allowing us to actually work in this different way? And that's how we came up with the social emotional wellbeing wheel. We thought we were fantastic. We came up with a wheel. So yeah, that's my history with it. I guess where I am now and where I've been since we published that chapter is I've really always been focused on making sure that we don't forget notions of law and the importance and the influence of law. And as I said, when we created that wheel, like if we're really honest with ourselves, we created it to teach white mob how to understand us better and our well-being better. So I've just been, I guess, over the last decade looking at how we can expand that model to be more inclusive of our real ways of knowing, being, and doing that all come from a position of law. So that's me. I'll hand over to Maddie. Hello.
Thanks, Clinton. I'm joining from beautiful Darkinjung country. I suppose for me, my journey with social and emotional wellbeing started pretty young. I think, I grew up experiencing different mental health conditions, watching a lot of grief occur within my community, and it really drew me to wanting to work in the mental health field and being a psychologist. So for me, it looked like when I was 14, 15, it was having conversations with people and hearing their experiences of what mental health looked like for them. And I think something that's only probably now I've reflected on is just the diversity of these experiences that I was hearing from people, but those common similarities of just wanting to be understood and wanting to be heard as a young person, and how crucial that was for them accessing treatment and getting support. And so I went on to study psychology, and now I'm doing my combined Masters of Clinical Psychology and PhD. Clinton's one of my supervisors alongside Professor Jenny Hudson, and my research is really looking at how we can better understand social and emotional wellbeing from young mobs' perspective. I think the social and emotional wellbeing framework and wheel has been such an excellent advancement in the space, but often we don't ask young people directly, and children particularly, what their experiences are like, because they aren't just mini adults. They often have really unique experiences of this. So my PhD has been a mixed methods model of looking at what that unique experience is for young mob and how they experience poor social and emotional wellbeing and good social and emotional wellbeing, but also really trying to improve our measurement of social and emotional wellbeing, because at the moment there's really no tools, or very minimal gold standard tools that are available that are culturally appropriate for measurement. So we've been doing some work and creating guidelines around cultural validity and what it means for something to truly be culturally valid, and providing recommendations of measures and how we can improve the development of measures. So we do have something that when a First Nations young person comes to seek treatment, we're not just giving them a white measure that doesn't actually reflect their experience. So getting towards the end of my PhD, which is very exciting. And I think for me, it's been a really great journey of getting to hear directly from young people's perspectives and from community members and how social and emotional wellbeing looks. As part of one of my placements, I was really fortunate to get to move to Alice Springs for a few months and work with an Aboriginal controlled health organisation there. And I would say it's one of the most really validating moments, sitting in a room with a client and actually being able to have a tool that's culturally appropriate, being able to show them the social and emotional wellbeing wheel and having people be like, yeah, this is my experience. So I think, I'm very grateful for Graham and Clinton's work, because they didn't necessarily have that. They're the ones who have to fight for this when they've seen that in their client work. But I was really grateful that when I got around to doing my placements, I actually did have something that was culturally appropriate, and getting to see the look of relief on an Aboriginal person's face when it's like, oh, you actually understand, you're willing to look at my culture and how that plays into wellbeing, instead of just trying to do these white and Western ways, which often happen within treatment. But I'll pass back over to you, Michael, so you can start our questions.
Well, thank you very much. And that's excellent that you're able to have that experience in Alice Springs, because that's invaluable in your development there. We thank our three speakers for introducing themselves. So now we've got a couple of questions. So we want everyone to put their questions up. We will endeavour to get to them all. But also, as I said, it helps us down the track with stuff we're planning to do. So, right. So now the first question I've got here is to Graham and Clinton from Gemma, or one of you can have a crack at it. If you could go back in time and do it again, i.e. when writing the book or conceptualising social and emotional wellbeing, would you do anything differently, given your experiences and your knowledge now?
Brother, you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would have done differently was ensure that probably we'd done two models. One that was the one that we came up with that has been a great educational tool and has really been beneficial for mob as well. But as I said, was really constructed to help educate non-Indigenous people at the end of the day. If I could go back and do it again, I probably would have constructed one that was inclusive of law from the beginning for mob, because we've kind of lost a decade of momentum in terms of making sure that people don't forget our old ways of knowing, being, and doing.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd echo those sentiments really from maybe another perspective that Clinton was talking about. I do feel like we lost. I'm not sure if it's lost a decade, but we could have sped things up anyway. Put it that way. If I mean, our first departure point was we had to try and create something that was simple enough that was going to speak to non-Indigenous Australia for those practitioners out in our community. That was a challenge, and our cultures, they're just so diverse and complex right across the hundreds of cultural clan groups around our countries. That was a real tension. So we had to settle for simplicity, just to get people into the ballpark area. But the cost of that, I think, was that we weren't able to really unpack cultural determinants of health and well-being to the extent that we have today, where we're naming cultural practices, law, strong law, what that looks like. We emphasise that there was a responsibility of practitioners to go in and really look at a local level about how that's manifest, that this was just a guide. But if I had my time again, I would have pushed much more for the implementation of the framework from the outset. And if I had known how many amazing young deadly mob like Maddison and other incredibly amazing young mob that I see who are using the wheel and just in such creative ways, I would have pushed much more for promoting our young mob to apply that and make it theirs from their own cultures, because the knowledge that's coming out is amazing, and we should have, I reckon, could have pushed that much more early in the beginning.
Oh, that's excellent. And look, my experiences at Specialist Aboriginal Mental Health Service was that we utilised the SOOB process, and we had a fundamentally different approach, which is exactly what you're both saying. And we treated the person and not the illness. The only thing that overrode it was risk, and that's a no-brainer. So, yeah, and the SOOB wheel played a big part in the person. So, and then when they were ready to tell us what was going on with them, we dealt with the mental health side of things and the acute SEWB stuff. So, no, that's excellent. Now, to Maddison from Cape. As someone who is closer to the early career stage of their profession, could you tell us a little about how you first encountered the concept of SEWB, social emotional wellbeing, and how the Working Together book influenced your learning?
Yeah, definitely. So I think all throughout undergrad, it was always very, Western models of psychology, and the biomedical model was what was kind of taught to us. But we were lucky to have a few lectures which did actually highlight Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, not merely enough. But that was really my first kind of introduction to this concept, to this model, but didn't really know much about what it was really, and never really got an opportunity to learn more, understand what that could look like in practice. And so when it came to the time of trying to pick my PhD topic, I had just finished my honours looking at psychometrics of like a child life interference measure. And I wanted to do something that would support mob, and thought like moving into measure development could be a really good area to go. And I think, started out being like, oh, we'll just look at anxiety and depression, which obviously was not the right approach to take. We should have taken a social and emotional wellbeing perspective from the start, but it was more around once I started doing research, when I started speaking to more Aboriginal researchers and clinicians in the field, is what kind of introduced me to like the SOOB model and just how important that was going to be. So my PhD moved away from just looking at anxiety and depression to actually just looking at social and emotional wellbeing and conceptualizing, anxiety and depression within that model, and trying to make sure that we were coming at it from a way that was really culturally appropriate. So that purple book has become my Bible throughout my PhD, and it's something that I utilize all the time in the work that I'm doing, and it's something that I utilize in my work clinically, but also I've found that it's got quite a lot of relevance cross-culturally, like with Indigenous populations around the world. I'm very fortunate to get to work in the mental health space with young lived experience advocates from around the world, with a really high percentage of those being people from First Nations backgrounds. And yeah, I've seen just the wheel be really applicable there, and getting to share what we know here in Australia and hear their insights. So yeah, the purple book is literally my Bible in all of the work that I do.
Yeah, that's excellent. And look, you're just starting out on your journey, and we look forward to your contribution over the years as you go. And to the other two gentlemen, fantastic too. Yeah, it's an interesting space. So now I've got a question from David, and this is to everyone. So which tools do the panel think are the best for measuring social and emotional wellbeing in a culturally appropriate way?
Ooh, that's a deadly, really good,
yeah, I know.
Really good question. So
that's a session on its own.
Yeah, I think for me, a starting point, which probably is already implicit in, was it David who was asking the question, that there's no universal scale or tool. They're just numbers, and social emotional wellbeing is intentionally very multi-dimensional to try and capture as many different aspects of our culture and our wellbeing as possible. So I don't think it's not a global construct, and there'll never be one tool. If we're going to go down the path of tools, it's always, which I have as well in my work, I've supported, I've done my own resilience and recovery tool for around trauma, and supported people like Professor Alex Brown with depression, and Catherine Chamberlain with complex trauma. So I think the key is really to pick an area of social emotional well-being that is your core interest and really focus on that one area and do it well if you're going to look for assessment tools and what have you. So that's first of all. And the second thing is the best tools, in my opinion, are the ones that are shaped from the ground up. So they start with local community, and bring the communities, through yarning and Indigenous research methodologies. You really take the time to build them up where you're looking at local cultural understandings of that phenomena of social emotional well-being that you are wanting to measure. And you start with really cultural theories that are developed from the mob on the ground. Then it's a process of developing the right language, and looking at how many questions you want to ask and bring it out into some kind of measure, whether that be, a qualitative or a quantitative measure, and then really, testing that out over time in different contexts. So, that's the way that I approach tools. I start with the local community and their concerns and their theories of change, and their language. And then we look at, how can we actually turn that into something that is usable? And it's really important that it is usable, because if it's too long, it's not going to work. We've found that simplicity is the way to go, and then just really, test that with the community in lots of different circumstances, in Aboriginal design programs, and in surveys that are for community and what have you. So, yeah, I'll leave it there and see what Maddison and Clinton think.
Yeah, I'm not going to take up much time at all because Mads has spent a lot of time investigating and writing about this. But what I would say is, and anybody who knows me knows, I'm not really a fan of assessment of anything, to be honest. I think we're human beings with a diverse experience across a whole spectrum of different things, and it's almost impossible to actually get a true measurement of any of that, in my personal opinion. But I think that we can scan and we can use things as indicators at different times. And I think the wheel itself is actually a really good tool for that. And through a set of about 9 questions, you can get people to literally map out that wheel for themselves, which becomes a picture in time of where they're at in terms of their own social emotional well-being and what they want to see change moving forward. So in terms of, I guess, intake or initial, pre-assessment, that's what I tend to do. Is I work with people with the wheel and I get them to draw it out themselves, map it out through a list of 9-10 questions. And then we look at what are the areas on that we should be applying our attention, our focus, our energy. So yeah, that's it for me. And I'm heading over to Mads. She's much more brilliant at unpacking this than I'll ever be.
Definitely untrue, but I will try my best here. So a big part of my PhD is actually looking at measurement tools, and what is actually culturally appropriate and valid. And so my research really focuses on children and adolescents. And there are a few measures that are a little bit better than others, but unfortunately we just don't tend to have measures that are specifically developed, Indigenous led and designed for children. It's a really, really significant gap in the field. We've just developed a tool actually called the First Nations Cultural Validity Assessment Tool, which is a framework and measurement tool that assesses the cultural psychometric properties of a measure. So I think really similar to what Graham was saying is that this is all really contextual. What is culturally valid with one community is not culturally valid with another community. And this can make measuring and understanding, cultural validity or what measurement tool do I use really difficult. And that was something that we heard a lot from researchers, which is what led us to develop the tool itself. But the tool, we're hoping to publish it soon, is essentially a set of it's a criteria. It's scored out of 15, but it looks at if the tool is Indigenous led and designed, if it was designed specifically for mob, if cultural experts, if Aboriginal people are involved in the design and the development of the measure, the psychometric properties of it, that all of that matches on to the population that you're doing. Because if I'm doing work here with young people in New South Wales, it's not going to be relevant to the work that Clinton's going to be doing in Queensland with young people. So I would urge you to keep an eye out for this tool. Just do a little bit of promo of mine and Clinton's work, but I do think highlights just the contextual differences that come up with cultural validity and how important it is to really look at each kind of young person or each research group you're doing or each person you work with within the context that they're in, because that means that the cultural validity will change and a measurement tool might not be appropriate, or it might be. But yeah.
If I can, that's absolutely true, Maddison. And Michael, if I can just jump in and say, what I think we're all saying as well is that tools should only ever be embedded in culturally grounded assessment processes. The word's been processed. A tool is not a diagnostic instrument. It has to be this. It's a bigger cultural assessment process, and the best ones I've seen are wrapped around being strength-based, even when they're focusing on distress and distress responses. They're strength-based, and if they're worth anything, then what they'll do is they'll lead to us or practitioners providing that person with support and additional supports and resources and referrals to community resources, cultural resources, mental health resources. It's about empowering the person by giving them opportunities to access those types of community and cultural resources. So I'm really big on strengths, personal, relationship, cultural and community strengths in the assessment and tool process.
That's excellent. Excellent answers. So to Graham and Clinton from KIT, in 2014, when you co-authored Chapter 4 of the book, along with Pat Dudgeon, Amanda Hart and Kerry Kelly, what was the existing knowledge base like on SEWB? Because, I don't think there was too much that was written about. But anyway.
Yeah, this is something that I actually spoke about when we launched the Gay Dewey Declaration the other night. Social wellbeing is a term that we've probably been using for about 30 years. Really kick-started with the work of Swan and Raphael. But it's a concept that I think we've held forever. This holistic notion of complete being in connection with anything and everything else around us is from, as I'd say, Gobblebidui, so from the beginning. So I think the language, so the specific term social-emotional wellbeing, we've probably been using that for about 30 years. And then that's where the research, I guess, where you see the term used in research. That in itself has brought around a few issues because globally the term social-emotional wellbeing has also been used, but from a pure mental health perspective. So what that kind of did was it led to this confusion within Australia that when we're talking about social-emotional wellbeing, and this continues, that when we're talking about social-emotional wellbeing as mob, that we're using it as this sort of quasi-fad term for Aboriginal mental health. I think people are still struggling to wrap their heads around the fact that we're talking around a holistic perspective of being, rather than we're only talking about Aboriginal mental health. And you kind of see this being encouraged, this confusion, through the way that social-emotional wellbeing funding flows down from government a lot of the time, in terms of a lot of the funding that flows down for what is termed social-emotional wellbeing, at the end of the day, is to do Aboriginal mental health support. So I think that has caused some issues in terms of people really being able to understand, non-Indigenous people and organisations and government agencies, etc., to really understand what it is that we're talking about and what our expectations are in terms of working to a social-emotional wellbeing model. I think we're getting better. I just have this slight fear that the language, the term itself may have been stolen by these outside forces or entities that aren't us, and that confusion may be really difficult for us to navigate and overcome.
Yeah, I'd agree with Clinton. The name social-emotional wellbeing, because it's used in different contexts, there's a risk of it being misleading, and I think besides the really important point that Clinton's talking about, that this is not a new concept. It's over 60,000 years old from a mob all around the country, right? This is nothing new, and our work also has a history of its roots, following in the footsteps of Pat Swan Delaney and then the late Beverly Raphael, but also the National Aboriginal Health Strategy way back in '89, the 2004 Social-Emotional Wellbeing Framework, Pat Dudgeon and Helen Mulroy. I think that one way of thinking about social emotional well-being is like land rights. There's been a history of resistance and reclaiming our ways of thinking about health. And this version, we wrote it up at a certain time, maybe where the stars, sort of aligned in that it's simple enough that it speaks to our communities and policymakers and some of our modern health services. So, I think that's a good way of looking at it. There was and always has been existing knowledge. This is just one version that seems to have, gained traction, which I think we feel really, really grateful for. And I do want to say too that Clinton's brother Tristan, who did the diagram, we want to acknowledge that particular diagram, was done by Clinton's brother, and I say that because it helps when you have a simple diagram. I think it speaks to people anyway.
Yep. Excellent. Have you got any thoughts, Maddison?
No, I think it's all
okay.
been said pretty well here.
Yeah, no, that's very well. Okay, so I've got a question to all from Finola. I hope that's how I pronounce it. I would be interested to hear perspectives on providing culturally appropriate and wellbeing informed programs or reporting channels for First Nations staff members in the workplace, i.e. reporting channels available for bullying, discrimination, misconduct, etc. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, so I guess that was a large piece of the focus of my PhD work, to be honest, is we really do need to take a systems approach to this, and we need to recognise the different experiences that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have in workplaces, work environments, and policy needs to be adapted to ensure that it actually aligns with that diverse experience. And mind you, it's not just us as First Nations mobs that experience a realm of difficulties in different work environments and spaces. I think workspaces often haven't grappled very well with the notion of cultural diversity and other forms of diversity within the workplace. So it needs to start with policy, and policy is driven by leadership. So, when we look at some things, like one of the big areas that I do a lot of work in today is helping organizations to incorporate phrasing and notions of lateral violence into their policy framework. So where workplace bullying or where other forms of abuse may be present within their policy documents, is ensuring that lateral violence is actually explained and is present and is attended to in there. And I think for certain forms of the experiences that we have, the problem with reporting is there's been nothing to report against because it's not captured within a policy. So lateral violence is a prime example of that, of without lateral violence being present within policy, there was nothing to report against in terms of the experience that you were having. It would get written off as potentially some workplace bullying, and there's some confusion around there, or it just wouldn't be understood, and so people wouldn't tend to come forward with it. So the more that we've been able to help organisations to implement lateral violence pieces within policy, the more organisations have been able to empower their staff members to be able to come forward because there's something to report against. So the familiarity of a concept, I think, makes a very big difference.
Good response. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Maybe just flowing on, there's the reporting process that's important. But when I was a clinical coordinator at a community-controlled service, when there were conflicts, some of those conflicts I found that the HR processes and all this just were really insufficient, and that sometimes you got to go back to cultural protocols and local cultural ways of resolving conflict. And what I mean by that is sort of structured processes where you'll have two parties or two mob who are having a dispute, and you actually sit down like we always have and really talk through it from the heart and person to person. And often in structured processes, you'll have an elder or a neutral party from that community come and be part of that process. So I just think that also we should look at at cultural ways of doing that, as well as, I think that's just a really important component. And sometimes you've got to go down that HR path, but in my experience, you got to think outside the box too, and I guess go back to law, like Clinton's work's been talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd reinforce that, we've always dealt with conflict through reconciliation. Reconciliation isn't a new concept or a new thing for us as mob. We've always dealt with conflict through processes, managed processes of reconciliation, where different parties, arguing parties or in conflict parties, come together and through a process of negotiation and compromise, get to a position of resolution that everybody is okay with. It's about recognizing that it's not about each party walking away with everything they want, but everybody being able to walk away okay with the resolution, and then it's dealt with. So that's been one of the magic things of our old ways of working, is that when conflict was worked through our processes of reconciliation, and these processes are still undertaken, that's it. It's done. You walk away, and the animosity isn't present anymore. It's dealt with. It's considered dealt with, and everybody's allowed to go back to what they do and to being well again. And I don't think we incorporate processes like that into Western workspaces. And I think that's problematic for everybody, not just for, they have mediation, but mediation is a very different thing to a process of reconciliation.
Yeah, look, they're excellent comments. And, we take so long to develop our workforce, but we can lose a key worker in a moment in that scenario. And then you got to start again, and you don't get countrymen going back, countrymen or countrywomen. And that's one of our bigger problems. So, no, that's excellent. So to all from Mark, and this may be the last question, depends how long we take, but we want to implement SEWB into at-risk management and support for Aboriginal people in WA prisons. Any cautionary tales or advice?
Can you say it again, please?
Okay. This is from Mark, we want to implement SEWB into at-risk management and support for Aboriginal people in WA prisons. Any cautionary tales or advice, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's been, different jurisdictions have tried different forms or levels of incorporation of social emotional wellbeing within prison systems. And I guess some of the cautions that I'd have, or some of the problems that I've witnessed here in Queensland is, again, when that term social emotional wellbeing is being used, but it's not being enabled to be enacted in a way that actually fits with our understandings of the concept. So that becomes frustrating, both for people who are trying to provide a service, but I'm sure it also becomes frustrating for agencies, that confusion. So one of the things that I think is really important is upfront making sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what is encapsulated by social emotional wellbeing in this context, however we're going to be using it. So then the service provision can be shaped around the agreed upon concept.
The other thing that I would add, and this is probably obvious to the fellow who has asked the question, but I just want to name that any tool can be used, it can be helpful or it can be harmful, and particularly around risk. The questions you ask if you're going to design a social emotional wellbeing measure are really important, and that's where a lot of the strength-based stuff comes into it. I have seen, and we've developed some tools where community gave us explicit feedback not to ask personal details around trauma exposure, for example, when we're looking at distress, because there was so much risk that the responses would enact child removal and other outcomes when the tool is actually meant to be used as a resource to strengthen people. So it is to be very, very careful about the nature of the questions you're asking. and to make sure that there are really strong trainings and protocols embedded within that, and that it's overseen by an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander advisory group to make sure that that tool is not being misused as a tool of harm. And let's face it, it happens. So I think that's some of the cautionary lessons that I've learned along the way, is sometimes it's better not to ask things because they're going to be, there's too great a risk for it to be misused.
Yep. Anyone else? That's good.
I think the only other thing just to add is like the core, like I suppose key construct with social emotional wellbeing is that it's about the interconnection with all of those 7 domains, and people within who are incarcerated, often they are completely disconnected from a lot of those domains, particularly things like culture and country. So I think in building a model, in building a measurement tool, it's really important to acknowledge how the system that you're in is going to heavily influence on somebody's ability to connect in. But that also doesn't mean that somebody doesn't have connection, because people can feel connected to culture still without being able to, be back on land and be back on country doing those things. So I think that would just be my only other thing to note, is just to consider about the disharmony because of the interruptions to the connections, and how you can go around asking that, but also creating a program that helps to facilitate those connections back for a person to feel strong in themselves and well-being.
Yeah, Michael, if I could add something important that Maddison has triggered in my mind as well, is particularly in a forensic or in that setting, it can actually be harmful to use a screening or risk tool if you don't have the resources available within that environment to respond and support the person that you're doing the risk and assessment tool with, and that happens far too often. So in that space, there needs to be a full and strategic resourcing of how they're going to support them, and if they're going to implement some kind of assessment tool, in my opinion.
No, that's excellent. Now, one last final quick question. You take as long as you like. For all from Barbie, that's what it says, Barbie from Derbyl Yerrigan. Any real-world advice on how to effectively engage young mob as a SEWB service, given that's the future?
Yeah, I think on that, it's like meet the young person where they're at. Young people come to you at all different kind of stages of their journey, of understanding of culture, of understanding of SUB, and really meeting that young person where they're at. Getting out of the clinical setting can be really useful. For a lot of our interviews, they were really just good yarns, and we did them outside on country. A lot of clinical work that I've done, we've done out on country, and just the impact of being out of a space that's not as clinical can be really powerful. But I think in the interest of time, just meet the young person where they're at and listen to the things that they've got to say and that are important to them.
Yep, good.
Yeah, just furthering on what Maddie was just bringing up, we've always understood the duality of everything. So, the whole yin and yang, that's not an Asian concept, to be precise. It's much older than that. It's a concept that we've held within our ways of knowing and being without using that language for a very, very, very long time. And we can apply that to anything. So when we're in a situation as an older person working with younger people, it's about us understanding the duality of the relationship. We understand it for my mob through the relationship between father and child. So Booba the father and Guyoli the child. So I only have opportunity to learn how to be a father through having children. Yes, I get some observation when I'm a child of fathering, but I only get the experience of fathering through having children. And so the child is as much the teacher as the father is the learner. And I think when we're working with young people, that's really important for us to recognize, is that we don't hold a higher position as such. We're there to learn how to be better ourselves in the work that we do with young people. And the only way that we can actually learn that is allowing ourselves to hear the voices of young people as our teachers.
Excellent. Okay, so anyone want to add to that, or that's it? Because we're kind of running towards the end, but that's all right. Okay, so thank you very much to you three for coming to the, for agreeing to do this. It's been fantastic. It's never long enough. But a very, very big thank you to our three panellists, Graham, Clinton and Maddison. Your wisdom and your counsel is fantastic. And we look forward to hearing more about it in the future, especially young Maddison, who's just starting on her journey. So hopefully we can support you in any way, and you can contact us anytime. So you can download the Working Together book for free on the Kids Research Institute website. And very soon it will be available for download on our own website at Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing. We'll be sending you all an email to notify everyone when this happens. At that time, you will also be able to view the video we've created with the editors and some authors and users of the book. And we certainly thank everyone for their contribution and consent in getting involved with us. We will share the recording from today's event, along with the slides and relevant links to everyone who registered. And don't forget, you can follow us at Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing on social media. And finally, thanks to the crew here at UWA. They're a fantastic team, make me look okay. I was getting a bit worried. I was looking at the video and I was thinking, geez, I look a bit like Peter Dutton. I might have to wear a wig or lose the glasses. But once again, thank you very much. And we'll be talking to you people in the future very shortly. But thanks to everyone for participating, and we'll see you on our next webinar or event. Very much appreciated.
Yellow.
Take care.
Yep. Bye. All good.